Welcome to Grid Talk. My name is Jawad, and today we are here to review the 2026 Japanese Grand Prix. And joining me today, we have the wonderful Ruby Price, Grid Talk co-host. Hello there.
Hello, how you doing, Jawad?
Yeah, doing well for a Sunday evening. And let's get stuck into it because Kimi Antonelli has backed up his win in China, his maiden Grand Prix win, with another win from another pole position, becoming the youngest ever championship leader as well in Formula One's history. Now, that record was previously held by Lewis Hamilton going back to 2007 when he was 22 years old, and now we have had that record smashed to 19. Tell us, Ruby, what did you make of Kimi's race today? Did you think when he lost the lead at the start that he would be able to recover? And did you have him leading the World Championship as early as, we are in this season?
Well, I'm going to try not to keep coughing during this section. That was very well timed. But what can I say? Kimi Antonelli, yes, absolutely. Wins from pole, becomes the youngest ever championship leader. It's fantastic for Kimi, and I think vindication for the criticism that was levelled around him and Mercedes signing him, during 2024, and of course his debut season in 2025. I thought as soon as he lost it off the start, it was disappointing to see from that perspective. But it's kind of consistent with what we've seen from Kimi so far in 2026. And Mercedes, we should also say, they haven't made the greatest of starts, but the power unit that they've got, in the back of that wagon is unbelievable. And they're matching that with good racing and, making some good decisions, particularly around the strategy as well. But, Kimi Antonelli, just as soon as he was in that race winning position, grasped it tightly with both hands and did not let go. It was a champion's drive almost from Kimi Antonelli today. Not the same level of mistakes that we saw in China from him with all those lockups towards the end, but just controlled and, very, very good. And just from that safety car restart, knew exactly what he needed to do.
And yeah, with that enforced break now until early May with the Miami Grand Prix, he will have led the World Championship longer than his teammate George Russell as well. So let that sink in. And George has waited how many years since he's been in F1 to lead the championship, and his teammate in his sophomore year comes along and does it in a couple of races. So that's quite something. But you mentioned safety car there, Ruby. We need to discuss Ollie Bearman's massive shunt on lap 22 of the race. It was a 50G impact that he had going into the barriers at Spoon Curve. Now, at the time, we probably couldn't proportion any blame, and I still believe we can't really proportion any blame to either Bearman or to Franco Colapinto in the Alpine that was ahead of him. But what that incident has brought about is this discussion again about the power unit regulations. Now, while the racing on track has been excellent and entertaining, I think from a safety perspective, this was something that we were warned about by not only, the drivers, but also McLaren's Andreas Stella said at the start of the season that there could be a potential massive incident with the disparity between closing speeds. And now Bearman, who he escaped, thankfully, with only some bruising to his right knee, said that there was a 50 km/h difference between his closing speed into the corner versus Colapinto's. Now, what do you make of all this? And, what do we need to do moving forward? Because are we going to wait till a more massive accident happens, or do changes need to be made on that front?
Yeah, it is certainly a very good question. When we shouldn't really be seeing drivers having these kind of incidents. It's not what racing's about. Obviously, people have this joke around, oh, there were no crashes at turn one, turns off the race because it was boring now. That's not what Formula One's about. It's not about collisions. It's not about drivers crashing into each other. This isn't NASCAR. Cheap dig at NASCAR aside. Ollie Bearman goes into the corner with so much more speed, as you say, than Franco Colapinto. And this is a tale that we saw in pre-season testing, in winter testing, in Australia, in China, and of course we've seen it happen in Japan. And yeah, it's great that he's been able to limp away from the scene. It's great to see drivers getting out of the car and, under their own power and mobility, and very important that they go and get checked out afterwards. But, what we are seeing because of these new regulations is this gulf in closing speed, that Formula One hasn't necessarily had before. And, having rewatched the incident, it's not necessarily that Franco turns left. I think he just stops turning right as much. And Bearman had such that difference in closing speed that as he's gone to take avoiding action, it's taken him straight onto the grass, into a polystyrene block, and directly into the barrier. Now, obviously, that particular corner in Suzuka is a bit of an awkward one. It's always tightening up if you go to the left of the car ahead. So unless you are turning right, you are going to go on the grass, as Ollie Bearman did. But, it is a real concern around safety, seeing what's going on with these teams and drivers. And, hopefully the FIA can come to some form of decision that prompts a change, even if that is just that now teams have to change the way they're approaching entering corners, because maybe it is just going to be a side effect of these regulations that cars slow down into corners much more. We did also see George Russell obviously having what looked like a potential power unit issue. The suspicion is that it was actually just about a difference of deployment, at a very similar corner when it came to Leclerc making an opportune move. And obviously the two of them didn't come together. Leclerc didn't end up in the barriers, but, racing is obviously about reacting to what goes on the track. And if with the knowledge that these cars are going slower into corners, maybe drivers need to change their approach into corners, as much as that probably goes against all instincts that these drivers have been developing.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there with the comment about drivers potentially changing their approach. But some drivers are sounding quite stubborn as ever when it comes to this. And we'll get to some comments made by the drivers on the regulations, the same ad nauseum thing again. But we did see the FIA make a statement after the race saying that they will be conducting a review and also looking at some simulations as well, in regards to the power units between now and the next Grand Prix in Miami, with safety always remaining a core element of the FIA's mission. GPDA Director Carlos Sainz as well was saying after the race that it was lucky that there was an escape road at Spoon for Bearman, but imagine going to somewhere like Baku or Singapore or even Vegas. We may end up having a literal Sunny Haze incident in real life if this happened in Vegas, for example. So, yeah, I think it's just going to be interesting to see how the power units are then recalibrated, or the energy is utilized moving forwards. I personally think that the power units, the 50-50 split is great. It's just about how can they iron out some of these bumps that, inevitably we see early on in a regulation cycle, but we're just too quick with our keyboards and crayons and really want our opinions out there. And some of the drivers are no different too. They should be ambassadors of the sport, yet here we are. It's dragging the sport over coals. But let's talk about some of the drivers who were impacted on the track, their races impacted by the safety car. And we'll come at first to Antonelli's teammate George Russell, who sounded quite aggrieved on the radio at the timing of the safety car. He had just pitted a lap beforehand, responding to then race leader Oscar Piastri's pit stop, and he cycled out P4 or P5 and wasn't able to get back on the podium at the end of the day. But it wasn't just Russell's race impacted by the safety car. Both McLarens as well pitted beforehand and ended up having to fight their way back up to the positions. Is this some sort of crack we're seeing early on with Russell, who hit the ground running in Melbourne and looked strong early on in China, and he's just not been on it this weekend and a little bit more irate on the radio in Japan?
Yeah, I definitely think George Russell was affected by the safety car. There's been, maybe a shift in his approach to this particular weekend, particularly after Kimi Antonelli outclassed him, for want of a better phrase, in China. I don't think George was expecting to see Kimi on the top step when we saw him, at the very least, and because of that, has then come into this weekend very much almost on the back foot. There's a new challenger approaching, and his like seemingly inevitable position as leader of the team could potentially, come under scrutiny. And, we saw last season with Oscar Piastri, just because you've got the experience doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be the lead driver. Obviously, if your team principal is very much pushing for one of you to win, that's going to happen. But at the same time, George has come into the Japanese Grand Prix needing a result in order to not lose his title position ahead of his teammate, and his teammate has just then gone, all right, cool, I'm gonna win this race, in his 19-year-old Italian style, and also taking a couple of detours. But yeah, George Russell was comfortable having a fight with Oscar Piastri before the safety car came out. Obviously, Piastri then pitted and lost that track position. Having said that, if we retain track position, we'll probably stay ahead of the Mercedes. And then once it came to it, then the safety car happened. Yeah, he's going to feel aggrieved about that. But Mercedes didn't know there was going to be a safety car. He didn't know there was going to be a safety car. McLaren didn't know there was going to be a safety car. I think George should kind of be happy that he was still out ahead of Lewis Hamilton after Lewis had done his pit stop under the safety car, because it looked for all expectations as though Hamilton was going to jump Russell when that safety car came out, and obviously he didn't. I think it was more because Russell could push to where the safety car line was, whereas Hamilton couldn't, which put George in front of him. But he certainly should feel disappointed about it. I don't think Mercedes should be swapping positions because of it. The fight in the championship is currently between the two of them, and it should be settled on track. We don't want another papaya rules incident for 2026. I at the very least don't want that. And then the McLarens also, I think, Piastri will feel hard done by, and I think he has more of a reason to feel hard done by than George, because Piastri was winning this race and probably could have done if it wasn't for the safety car.
Yeah, he definitely demonstrated the pace at the start of the race when he took over. It was a lightning start from him. The fact that he got to start a race so already into three races into the season and we hadn't seen him start yet is quite befuddling. But a great one from Oscar, and perhaps a bit of optimism to be taken away from that as well, because Mercedes have so far been the dominant force, and yes, they did win this race, but McLaren being, I guess, a non-manufacturer team, a customer team. A lot of talk has been about that the customer teams may not get a chance to win in this power unit era. McLaren, showing that, when they get ahead and some clean air, they do look quite strong, even if they haven't fully optimized that Mercedes power unit. So it'll be interesting to see when they do fully optimize those tools, how they, fare and where they do end up in the order. So yeah, it was a very, very strong performance from Piastri. You could call it perhaps a five-star performance. And we'll segue through to the five-star rating of this podcast. Well, if you enjoy this podcast, we would love it if you could take five to leave us a five-star rating on Spotify or a five-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you are listening and aren't already subscribed as well to the channel, please consider helping us out with a like and subscribe. And we'll go to the final spot on the podium now with Charles Leclerc. Now, bit of a surprise to see him up there, ultimately beating out Russell for that final spot on the podium. It was a nice battle that they had at the end of the race. So many good battles at the front of the in front of the race. I don't know what all the negativity is about at the moment around F1, but Leclerc has been someone who's sort of joined Max Verstappen's chorus of negativity this weekend around the 2026 regulations. Now, coming into the weekend, there was the announcement that for qualifying in particular, there would be an adjustment to the power unit settings where teams would be mandated to have a limit of 8 megajoules as opposed to 9 to prevent super clipping. Now, that seemed to have made whatever issues Leclerc's having on his Ferrari at the moment worse in qualifying, and he went on a expletive-laden rant after qualifying, blasting the regulations. Max has been the same throughout the weekend as well. I mean, is again, Ruby, is it a case of, because they're not in a Mercedes at the moment, they're going to be upset with the regulations as a whole rather than perhaps looking inwards and looking at what could the team do better? What can Ferrari do better from an engine side to optimize their PU? And similarly with Red Bull powertrains and Ford.
Yeah, I think, we've obviously seen a lot of negativity from Charles coming into this weekend post qualifying, joining that chorus of negativity that you've mentioned as well. And, he's qualified fourth and finished in P3 on the podium. That's not a win. Charles will be disappointed that's not a win by, of course, I'd be disappointed if I was in Charles's position. He's in Formula One to win and hasn't had a win now for a while. I don't think Ferrari won last season. The stats aren't off the top of my head, and I've been up since 5 a.m. with a clock change. Nothing's coming immediately to mind for recall, but at the very least, if you're not winning, you're always going to be unhappy. At the moment, the change in regulations is a very easy target if you're feeling unsatisfied, because it is a big change and it's trying to shake up the formula. Would Charles be complaining about the regulations if he was winning? Would Max be complaining about the regulations if he was winning? No, because he'd be winning, and for all of the other complaints about things, it would be, well, change your car. Ground effect era. Oh, Red Bull have got an inherent advantage because they have a car designer who, studied and pioneered the ground effect era. Well, the other teams, they should just change their car and get new Venturi tunnels and, optimize it for the regulations. At the same time, Ferrari have that baked in advantage off the start with their turbo. If Charles gets a change to the regulations, maybe that turbo advantage disappears. At the very least, I think Charles has had a decent weekend. It was not the qualifying that he wanted. He only got P4. He wants to be at the front. It was not the result he wanted. He only got P3. He wants to be at the front. But at the same time, we are seeing so much more action on track. We are seeing cars make overtakes and then get repassed and then make another pass. Some of Charles's moves this weekend were unbelievable. Hanging it around the outside of turn 1, hanging it around the outside of turn 2, seeing the Ferraris fighting with each other, seeing the Ferraris and the Mercedes fighting each other. Yes, Antonelli's won the race by the distance that he's won, but it's because the current regulations, if you spend all your time squabbling and draining your battery fighting each other, and the car in front of you isn't doing that, then the car in front of you is just going to make that time. So, I'm not saying don't fight. I'm just saying choose your battles.
Choose your battles exactly, and that's, my point earlier about Oscar in the first stint is that he was able to, choose exactly where he used his energy and managed to hold off Russell. And with the benefit of clean air and track position, he went on his merry way. So perhaps, we'll see that from a Ferrari at some point this season, or even a Red Bull. But at the moment, as it stands, it's just the negativity that's coming out of them, which it's just ad nauseum. But for Max, I guess we did see some glimmer of, his old self in terms of on-track performance. He had a Q2 exit in qualifying and went up to P8, but ultimately lamented the faster Alpine of Pierre Gasly. Yes, I said the Alpine is quicker than the Red Bull at the moment. I don't know what, parallel universe we're living in. But that being said, we saw Max jump in a GT3 Mercedes last weekend, and despite the fact they were disqualified for a technical infringement, he went on and won a endurance race at the Nürburgring. He surely he's surely doesn't have a shortage of hobbies to go and pursue outside of F1. Should he really just, pack his bags and have a little sabbatical, do what Alain Prost did in, 1992, and go spend life outside of F1, or do what Alonso did, after all those years of pain with McLaren Honda.
I said this after I became aware of the fact that Max Verstappen has made it into Q3 once this season, whereas Isaac Hadjar has made it into Q3 three times this season. It's very much 2014 vibes from the Red Bull team at the moment. You've got this new regulation set. The experienced four-time world champion isn't necessarily adapting to them as much, whilst the younger, much less experienced and previous season received some criticism over the appointment of going into that top team, flourishing. And of course, Isaac Hadjar's then not necessarily finished ahead of Max Verstappen in today's race. The safety car could be one element of that, but Max was ahead and alongside Hadjar quite early in this race. But that's it was the race start circumstances, and you were going up against a four-time world champion. I said this during the Lewis Hamilton depression era last season. If Max Verstappen isn't enjoying Formula One, he's certainly got plenty of options outside of Formula One that he can go to and seemingly enjoy a lot more. We know Max is a big fan of endurance racing. We know Max is a big fan of sim racing, and we know that Max is very vocal when it comes to how he's feeling. Previously, he's had a car that is able to challenge for the front and be on a regular basis. And last season, he had a car that was able to get close enough to the front and was able to get on top of the car enough in order to put his car at the front as well. I think if he's not enjoying it, he can go, But if he wants to influence Formula One, he has to remain in Formula One. But we've seen drivers enter that kind of tail spiral of nothing's going right, I'm not enjoying myself, and then they stick around and it keeps getting worse. And I don't think it would taint Max's legacy if he did stick around and things didn't necessarily progress. But at the same time, I want to see Max having a good time on the track, and I don't think he's having that at the moment.
And you've said that without a silly grin on your face, too. Credit if you get the reference. Let's move it on and perhaps, give the race and F1 itself a bit of praise as well. Because out of the 22 runners in this Grand Prix, we only had one that didn't see the checkered flag due to a mechanical failure or reliability issue. We had obviously Bearman crash out, which meant that there was only 20 finishes, but it shows progress on the reliability side in these new regulations to go from the first two races where we had, cars not starting the race or, failing to make the grid to retiring midway through the race to the fact we're celebrating Aston Martin making the checkered flag with one of their cars this weekend, the new father, of course, Fernando Alonso. Um, like there is sense of celebration in that, but then there's also, I feel like, a sense of poor reflection upon your established teams like a Williams and Aston Martin because their teams coming into this season, we had higher expectations on, but they're essentially out there running glorified test sessions in a Grand Prix. I know you feel strongly about this, and the elephant in the room here is, I haven't mentioned Cadillac because they can be excused for the fact that they're using these early races as a bit of a test session. But they got both cars to the checkered flag as well today, and, perhaps seem like they're in a more positive space than Williams and Aston Martin in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. Cadillac are a brand new team. Every single race weekend is a brand new set of data that they haven't had access to previously. Aston Martin and Williams are teams that have existed for decades, if you obviously go into Aston Martin's previous team identities as well. Um, but what we're seeing is not racing. You know, what we're seeing when we celebrate Fernando Alonso getting to the end of the race 2 laps down is that, they are just treating races as test sessions, practice sessions. And, I think if people are going to have a crack at the new regulations and what that's doing to Formula One, I think established teams treating live competitive sessions as test sessions is a bit more of a problem to me, at the very least. I think Aston Martin, have the money, they have the personnel, they have the facilities to not be doing what they're doing, which, as far as I'm concerned, is slightly embarrassing for the team. Um, Williams wrote off 2025 to an extent in order to talk a big game and show up to 2026 with what was going to be the challenger of all challengers, at the very least taking them from the rear of the midfield to, one of these teams that was able to compete with the McLarens, the Ferraris, and the Red Bulls on a weekend to weekend basis. That's obviously not what's happened now. And, whether that's just because they weren't big enough to be able to make that challenge. Formula One, it's a bit like how the Premier League in football has gone from a league that you could enter and at least be competitive in a sense without spending the same level of money as the top teams. But now, even in this cost cap era, those teams at the top have just got such a baked in advantage that the teams lower down do not have the ability to make that jump as much without basically just copying exactly what those leading teams are doing. And you're not going to win by copying. Just ask Aston Martin 2023.
I still believe, though, McLaren is a great example to use in this cost cap year, and I really am disappointed that Williams haven't got that, just I thought investing in their infrastructure and resources as they have been, like you said, they wrote off 2025, thinking that, all the eggs will be in the 2026 basket, still hasn't yielded them yet. But McLaren's a great example to use with how midway through a regulation set, they were able to really get on top of things and really see the progress and hard work of their investments pay off. And the fact that, we have the cost cap now means that any of them should, if they are well resourced and utilizing their resources well enough, and that's the key term. You could have all the resources in the world like Aston Martin does, for example, but they're an example of not utilizing them perhaps in the best possible way. So that's going to be an intriguing topic to see develop across the season as well, and see who else can join the fight up ahead. But interesting point too in our YouTube live chat that this is the first race of the season with three different constructors on the podium. So, that's quite good to see early on in a new regulation set too. So let's kind of wind things down now and talk about driver of the day. And Grid Talk's driver of the day was voted to be Oscar Piastri. So we could create a meme here even as well. He starts a race and gets driver of the day at the moment in 2026. We've only got the sample size of one Grand Prix from him so far. But did you have an alternative driver of the day, Ruby, or was the Aussie your pick as well?
Yeah, Oscar Piastri was my pick for driver of the day. Whilst I was covering for Louis from our predictions posting, I was looking into like who the drivers were that made the most changes of positions. I saw that Liam Lawson actually had a pretty decent race from that perspective of he gained the most positions, got into a points paying position as well. But I think Oscar Piastri just deserved driver of the day. He made a great start. The McLaren's off the line as well. We've obviously hyped so much about Ferrari. Now that Oscar Piastri's had a chance to take part in a race, wow. Got into that leading position, was not about to give it up, and then of course the safety car happened, and I think from that point he could have lost his head. He could have been a bit disappointed and fallen back, but when the safety car restart happened, he was able to defend that position, and it's kept him in the position that he's in. And yeah, if he keeps this up and starts the next race and gets driver of the day as well, we're looking at a very scary precedent. It might be Oscar Piastri driver of the season. But yeah, I definitely think he did enough to deserve driver of the day.
Yeah, forget about the World Championship. It's the Driver of the Day Championship that Piastri is going for this season. But let's look at some plugs here. And is there anything that you would like to give a shout out before we wrap up the show?
Yeah, I mean, I'll obviously, say if people want to hear more from me, you can find me on Instagram at Ruby Rose Price. But I'll also, since there is no Wayne to do it and no Louis to do it either, plug our Grid Talk socials at Grid Talk UK. Louis has been over at the Japanese Grand Prix this weekend, and he's been documenting that through, videos, vlogs, stories, and if you were following our socials, those are things you'll be able to look at. So yeah, go ahead to at Grid Talk UK on Instagram, Facebook. Our YouTube is also Grid Talk UK. If you're listening to the podcast on wherever you get your podcast platforms, but yeah, check us out and get involved in our predictions league.
Indeed, and I do hope Louis gets home at an appropriate time because those lines leaving the track looked pretty ungodly. So, best of luck to you, Louis, in getting home, and thank you for the content that you've provided on socials this weekend. I'll give a quick shout out to the driver ratings program that Tom Downey and I do on a Monday after the Grand Prix. So we'll do more in-depth driver analysis and talk about the drivers that we perhaps missed on this show, with our ratings as well for them on that show. But Grid Talk is available on YouTube as well as Amazon Fire, Spotify, Apple Music, Verbal, and Pocket Cast. Just search Formula One Grid Talk for our back catalogue of shows with previews and reactions to the race results. Thank you to Jared Bradley and Holly Eagle for supporting us on Patreon. If you want to support the show further, why not sign up to our Patreon for exclusive content, and also make sure you subscribe so you're the first to know when each new weekly episode is released. And we will be back soon with plenty more F1 content. Thank you very much for listening to the Grid Talk podcast, and goodbye.